Hi, good evening, everyone, or good morning, or good midday, depending on where you're tuning in from. I'm Garrett Nelson. I'm the president and head curator at the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. And you're tuned in tonight to a live talk with Professor John McCurdy, in which we'll be learning about the fine-grained geographies of colonial cities at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. Before we begin the program tonight, I want to take note of the complicated and contested threads that are woven through historical geography, including difficult stories that we neither can nor should ignore. The place that we now call Boston is the ancestral and current home to Indigenous peoples, including the Mashpee and Aquinnah Wampanoag tribes, the Nipmuc nations, and descendants of the Massachusetts people. Copley Square, where the Central Library is located, sits on top of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in North America. The maps that are in the Leventhal Center collections bear witness not only to histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts ranging from labor struggles to racial segregation. In some cases, the maps we have don't simply document these stories, but they actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. Throughout all of our programs and interpretation at the center and at the library, we encourage visitors to consider how these histories still exert real effects on the present day. Now, the talk you're tuned into tonight is part of the Richard H. Brown Seminar on the Historical Geography of the American Revolutionary Era. This series, now in its third episode, explores how maps and geography can open up new ways of understanding one of the most important periods of American history, a time when nations, borders, people, and the natural environment were in a state of dramatic flux throughout North America and across the Atlantic world. To learn more about upcoming events in this series, as well as other free programs and activities at the Leventhal Center, as well as information about visiting our current exhibition on environmental justice called More or Less in Common, either in person or digitally, visit our website at leventhalmap.org. Tonight, I'm also joined by my co-host, Dr. Alexandra Montgomery. Hi, Ala.
Hello.
Dr. Montgomery is a historian of early North America, and she is the postdoctoral fellow for the American Revolutionary Geographies Online Project, or Argo. I want to invite Dr. Montgomery to tell us a little bit about the Argo Project.
Sure thing. So Argo is a very exciting project that is coming to you, not live, but at some point in the very near future, from Mount Vernon down here in Lyman, Maryland, but in Virginia, as well as the Leventhal Map Center. And Argo is building on earlier collecting efforts by the Leventhal Center to bring together in one easily accessible, user-friendly online portal all of the digitized maps of North America created between 1750 and 1800. So the idea here is that we are collating all these wonderful maps that have been digitized by many other institutions. This is a multi-institution project. Put them all in one space that will be user-friendly, as well as filled with fun extras, such as essays and interactives that will help you better understand what these maps mean, what they meant at the time, and what they mean as we contemplate the meanings of these past events as we approach the 250th anniversary of the events, as well as the actuality of the American Revolution.
Thanks, Dr. Montgomery. And one of the most exciting parts about Argo is that we have a chance to bring in wonderful scholars who are approaching the historical geography of this period from all sorts of angles. We have two wonderful speakers in the series so far, taking us into the far-flung and unfamiliar geographies of the Revolutionary period. And tonight, we're really thrilled, both Alexandra and I, to be speaking with Professor John McCurdy. Hi, John.
Hello.
John is a professor of history and the graduate coordinator at the Department of History and Philosophy at Eastern Michigan University. He's a really kind of lively and interesting voice on the history of the American Revolutionary period, with a kind of fascinating spread of publications that many of which focus on the intimate spaces of contact between soldiers and civilians during this period. His publications include the book Quarters, The Accommodation of the British Army and the Coming of the American Revolution. That's from Cornell Press in 2019, as well as the book Citizen Bachelors, Manhood and the Creation of the United States, also from Cornell Press in 2009. Professor McCurdy has also quite recently published in the Journal of Urban History an essay called From Fort George to the Fields, the Public Space and Military Geography of New York City, richly illustrated with quite a number of maps, some of which we may see tonight. In tonight's talk, we've invited Professor McCurdy to speak for about 20 minutes about his research and on the topic of the urban military histories of this period. After that, Dr. Montgomery and I will chat with Professor McCurdy for about 20 minutes. And throughout that whole period, we really encourage engagement from the audience. Questions, observations, comments, places where you'd like us to go further or to reframe something. At any time, you can submit a comment on Facebook or YouTube in the questions section, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible in the last third of the talk. As always, our broadcasts are recorded and will be available after the fact on leventhalmap.org. But we really encourage those of you who are tuned in live to join us in the simulacra of a real seminar meeting and to have as much of a back and forth as possible in this remote space. So John, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Bring up my slides. There we go. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you all for being here and joining me this evening. And I'll try to be quick. I'll try to keep it to the 20 minutes. But I first want to just thank everyone at the Richard H. Brown Seminar, the Leventhal Center, and of course the Boston Public Library for making this possible. I especially want to thank Garrett Nelson, Alan Montgomery, and Megan Nally for making this possible. This is a real treat for me. So thank you very much. So I want to talk today. I want to start with where. I'm going to be talking from my book, and my book is Quarters. And the book focuses on quartering British soldiers in the lead up to the American Revolution. And so, I should just briefly say, what is quartering, right? So if you have soldiers, you have to have some place to put them, some place where they can sleep, take their meals, store their effects. And so this becomes very controversial and is a big deal leading up to the American Revolution. And we know that because in the Declaration of Independence, King George III is charged, among his other crimes, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. So the book really tries to get into what is quartering, why does it become so controversial, why does it become one of the causes of the American Revolution? And my argument has to do with place. And here's where we get into the maps. The meaning we give to the places we have, what is a home? Why do we think of a home as a private place? How do we think of the city and its operations? Who belongs in the city? These are all questions that are being hashed out in the 1760s and 1770s in this lead up to the American Revolution through this discussion over where will soldiers go. And so that's what I want to get at somewhat tonight. I want to give a little background. So I want to start by looking at this map. And I've tried to place the credits for all of my maps at the bottom of the screen and those that are available online, many through the Library of Congress. I've included the web link as well, but others I'll indicate where I borrowed these from for tonight's talk. To give a little background, for most of the colonial period, there were very few British soldiers in colonial America. There were some involved in, say, the conquest of New Amsterdam in 1664, in some of the frontier struggles in South Carolina in the 1730s. But as late as 1754, there were fewer than 800 British soldiers in the 13 colonies between Georgia and New Hampshire. It's a really small number of soldiers. This all changes in 1755 when Britain goes to war with France in what we know as the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War. And at the height of the French and Indian War, some 30,000 British soldiers come to North America to fight and ultimately defeat France and take control over Canada. So where are these soldiers going? Well, most of them will go to the action, which is taking place in Canada, in the backcountry. But during the winter, many of these soldiers will leave the theater of fighting and go to winter quarters in the cities of North America, of what will become later the United States, of cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, and throughout other places, other smaller regions along the coast. And they go here so they can rest, but also so they can recruit new soldiers for the coming war effort. So where do these soldiers go? Where are they going to quarter? Where are they going to sleep? Well, big cities, places like Philadelphia, have major institutions. In Philadelphia, they send the soldiers to the Pennsylvania Hospital, which had recently been completed, still standing. Charleston sends them to an abandoned school. But small towns and places like Maryland and New Jersey have no massive military infrastructure. And so the soldiers will ultimately go into people's homes and quarter for the winter in people's houses, often against their will. So the colonists are understandably very upset by this, because they, by the 1750s, are coming to see the home as a private place, a place that should be protected against the state and against the military. So where are they going to put all these soldiers? Because the war is going to drag on for a number of years, and the Americans also know that these soldiers may be returning time and time again. So beginning in 1756, colonists in all the major American cities build barracks, massive barracks to house soldiers. It's a huge infrastructure project, one of the largest infrastructure projects in the colonial period. By 1759, there are enough rooms for 7,000 soldiers in the 13 colonies that will later form the nucleus of the United States. After the French and Indian War ends in 1763, these barracks are still standing. Some of these are big permanent structures, and these will begin to influence the cities, because Britain continues to send soldiers to occupy these barracks and to remain a permanent part of these cities. And that's what I want to look at. Now let's get to the maps. So I want to look at 3 cities, if I have time to get to them all. The first is New York, and here we're looking at the famous Ratzer Math from 1769, probably sketched in 1767. And there are a lot of good maps of New York in the late colonial period, but this is one of my favorites and one of the most detailed. And I want to draw our attention to a couple of places. The tip of Manhattan, the Battery. I want to look at that, and then I want to look at that sort of triangle there in the sort of middle of the screen that we'll come back to, and I have close-ups of these. So if we look, first I want to look at the Battery. So this is the tip of Manhattan. Of course, the most important military infrastructure piece in New York is Fort George, #1 on the map. This is built on the basis of there had been a fort here since the Dutch controlled New York in the 1620s. The British continue to maintain this as a fort. But it's interesting because I also want to draw your attention to number 26, which is toward the bottom of the screen off to the left. This is indicated as barracks. This is the lower barracks. This is one of the sets of barracks that the colony of New York will build in 1757. We don't know a lot about the lower barracks. I have more to say up with the second set of barracks that they build as well. But just to mark that they have moved the soldiers outside of the fort into this formal barracks. And I think this is a good map because it gives us some sense of what's going on in the neighborhood around the fort and the barracks. We might notice the gardens. We might notice all the docks and the piers. Of course, this in the 1750s is the center of New York's trade. New York then, as now, is known as a trading center. And so it's interesting. We can imagine soldiers walking around these docks with merchants as well. I'd also draw your attention to number 25, sort of at the center of the screen. This is the stock exchange, right before it moves up to Wall Street. Right here in the middle of it, we would have soldiers right involved in the commerce of the city. The Bowling Green up above the fort, I would also draw your attention to. This, by 1770, is the place where there is a massive statue of King George III, which has been established. And Bowling Green had originally been sort of a common area, but by the 1760s, 1770s has become the first public park in New York City. Interestingly, I want to draw your attention also to number 21, just above the fort. And this is the secretary's office, the secretary of the colony. Why is his office right there next to Fort George? Well, let me go on to a second map, and I think we'll get a sense of why that is. This is a map from 1773 looking at Fort George specifically in Manhattan. And to orient yourself, this is upside down over what we had just seen in the previous slide. So north is down, south is up, which is confusing, but makes sense to the cartographer who makes this. If you look inside Fort George, you'll notice A is the mansion house. The governor lived here in the fort up until 1773 when the house burns down and the governor has to find someplace else to live. But there are also still these military infrastructure pieces within the fort. We see the stables, a guard room, flagstaff, the sentry box. There's a mixing of military purposes as well as political purposes here in late colonial New York. I want to shift up, going back to the Ratzer Math, moving up Broadway, because about a mile up Broadway from Fort George, Broadway splits into two, going off to the Bowery and Greenwich Village. And here I want to draw our attention to number 26. This is the second set of barracks that are built in New York, and these are, of course, the upper barracks. This is a massive barracks. It's believed that this could have held 800 men. And so it's a massive, important military structure. There are a series of outbuildings which aren't labeled here, but I would draw your attention to number 23, the prison, and number 24, the poorhouse, which are right there on top of the upper barracks. And we might sort of think of these as being similar structures, right? These are places where undesirable people live, places that no one else wants to have in the colony. Prisoners, the poor, and soldiers, all kind of lumped together, which that kind of says something interesting about this neighborhood. But I also want to draw your attention to that triangle there in the middle of the screen that's not labeled at all. This is New York City's Common in the colonial period. This is a place known as the Fields, and much like Boston Common, this is a place where people would take their livestock to graze. This is a place where the militia would muster. By the 1750s and 1760s, it's also becoming a public park. This is the place where big celebrations for the king's birthday take place. George Whitefield, the famous evangelist, will preach from here. There's a gallows in the Fields where people are put to death for crimes. The city's African-American community had a small burying ground just on the edge of this. So this is really one of the most public spaces in New York. And it's right there mixed up with all this military purpose. I also want to draw your attention to a couple of other things on the map. Number 9 is what's referred to here as the New Presbyterian Meeting House, or the Brick Presbyterian Church. Number 3, St. Paul's Church, which is, of all of these, the only structure still standing there. And then, of course, number 19, King's College, which will later become Columbia University and move up to Morningside Heights. But all of these are really elite institutions. And it's interesting, they're also gathering here around the barracks and this public space. New York really mixes up soldiers with all sorts of other things. The soldiers are really part of the city in a way that might confound how we think about the relationship between British soldiers and the American colonists. Of course, I also want to show you this. We have only one image of the barracks, the upper barracks from this era. And this is a political cartoon from the 1770s. And this is about the Liberty Pole. Standing here. And of course, this Liberty Pole is the symbol of liberty. It's erected to commemorate the repeal of the Stamp Act. We see in the prison off to our right, we have colonists who are lamenting their lack of liberty, people who are in the prison. We have a soldier in an abandoned house off to the left who is commenting on liberty. In the foreground is the poorhouse where there are no people, but back behind that is the only image we have of the upper barracks, a long, thin structure, probably a 2-story structure. Of course, today, these structures are long gone. If you know New York, you know basically where they are. The lower barracks in Fort George are at the end of the Battery. This is an image that was drawn in the late 19th century to try to understand where they would have been. And then the image on the right, the upper barracks are, of course, torn down shortly after the Revolution and replaced by City Hall. So City Hall Park basically is placed on top of what had once been the Fields. I want to shift to Philadelphia. This is one of the best images we have of a colonial era barracks. And I actually have stolen this from the Leventhal Center's website. And this is looking at the Philadelphia barracks. Philadelphia, of course, unlike New York, didn't have much of a military infrastructure. This was a city founded by pacifist Quakers or members of the Society of Friends. And so they didn't really think they needed a military. But when the British Army shows up in the 1750s, they quickly build a massive barracks to accommodate these soldiers. And instead of having 2 sets of barracks, there's one big barracks in Philadelphia. One visitor estimates that they could have held between 17 and 1,800 men, so about twice the size of the upper barracks in New York. This is also from the same image, also coming from the Leventhal website. This is an overview or a bird's eye view of the barracks in Philadelphia, and you can see, if you follow C, would be rooms that would have held enlisted men or soldiers. B would be rooms with officers, and A, the colonel's house, the colonel being the commanding officer of the regiment. And as you can see, the barracks in Philadelphia make a big U, and this makes it easy for us to find where it is in the city. So if we look at a map of Philadelphia from this is, I believe, from 1777. This is a map of Philadelphia, and we can see at this point, Philadelphia is really mostly pushed along the Delaware River. It hasn't spread out to the Schuylkill yet. But Philadelphia decides it originally is going to put a massive barracks in the center of the city, maybe where, if you know Philadelphia, the place where City Hall is today. That's believed to be where the barracks were going to go. They go ahead and get a contract. They hire workmen. But they ultimately don't build it there. Instead, they take that big U-shaped structure and build it north of the city. And you can see it on the image to the right, which is a blow up of the one on the left. The U next to the A, the U-shaped structure next to the A, is the barracks in Philadelphia. And it's built in the suburb of Northern Liberties, outside of the city proper. We can also see this here, and this is another map of Philadelphia, also coming from about the same era, about 1777. Again, if you know Philadelphia, north is to your right, right? The Delaware is at the bottom. And if you look to the lower right-hand corner, you see a little gray square that says Barracks. This is also indicating where this would be relative to all of the action going on in the city. So why did the Philadelphians choose to build their barracks not in the center of the city like New York did, but off to the side? Well, it's understood that this was a sense of removal. There was a speculation that they might want to turn the barracks later into warehouses or places for merchants. But it was also this was allowed them to keep the barracks sort of outside of the nice part of town. Northern Liberties was being outside of the city proper, was a place where there could be livestock, and livestock were slaughtered. Blood would run in the streets. It also had a very violent reputation. The Northern Liberties was a very poor neighborhood, known for violence. The barracks were built within a block of something called Bloody Lane, known for a famous murder late in the colonial period. So this was really a way of trying to push the soldiers out of the sort of mainstream and off to an undesirable suburb. Of course, today, if you were to go to Philadelphia, the colonel's house stands till about the middle of the 19th century. But if you go to Northern Liberties today in Philadelphia, you find redevelopment and some abandoned taverns in this area. Finally, and I'm probably running over time, but I just want to touch briefly on Boston, because of course Boston's also interesting to the story. Boston, being an early colonial city, also of course has a fort, Fort Hill, which you can kind of make out in the southeastern piece of the peninsula. That was Boston in the 18th century. By the time of the Revolution, this fort, known as Fort Hill, or what is now known as the neighborhood of Fort Point, had pretty much collapsed. And that's because Boston didn't have its defenses in the city, but really had them out in the harbor, most famously Castle Island, which you can see on this map. Down in the lower right-hand corner of the map, you see sort of a large fortress. This is indicating Castle Island, where there was Castle William. To zoom in a little bit on Castle Island, this is an image probably taken from an image drawn in 1771, where we can see the castle on the island, as well as the barracks that were established there. And to just zoom in a little closer on that, I want to draw your attention to K, which is inside the Castle William itself. These are barracks for the artillery. These are casemates, or places, basically rooms built into the wall, but also the long barracks off to your left, barracks that would hold up to about a regiment of soldiers, up to about 400 men here on Castle Island. Of course, Boston then is unique from the other two colonial cities in that its barracks are not in the city or next to the city. They're off on an island out in Boston Harbor. And there is discussion about building a barracks in the center of the city, but it doesn't happen. This becomes, of course, a big problem when in 1768, 4 regiments of British soldiers arrive and need a place to be quartered, and there are no barracks for them. Instead, the soldiers will be quartered in tents on Boston Common or in Faneuil Hall, and even the Massachusetts State House. That's a temporary quarters. Later they will be moved into warehouses. Of course, these are the soldiers that will later become involved in the Boston Massacre. To show one last map, and then I'll shut up here. There is, of course, after the Boston Massacre, the soldiers pull away. They come back in 1774 with General Gage, now governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Gage. He brings in, by the August of 1774, there are 3,000 British soldiers in Boston, way more than the barracks at Castle Island can hold. Gage envisions building barracks on Boston Common But from all the maps I've seen from 1776, 1777, there are no barracks are ever built on Boston Common, as you see from this map from the MHS. There are simply tents represented there. Of course, this is Fort Independence, which you would know, which would be on the place formerly had been the Castle Island. And then I will bring it to a close. So again, I'm John McCurdy. This is my email address, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Super. Thank you so much, John. It's a good thing that I had my screen video off during that, because I was sort of this close up to my screen with all these amazing maps. It was really a fantastic presentation. Just to remind our audience, we invite questions at any time. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible in the last third of our presentation tonight. If you're logged in on either Facebook or YouTube, you can type them in at any time. You don't have to have a sophisticated historical question to ask a question. You can say that you want to hear more about any of the topics that Professor McCurdy has covered, or to see another map, or any other related questions. But we're going to kick it off with Dr. Montgomery and I having a little bit of a chat with Professor McCurdy to extend some of the themes we've just heard about, and to discuss some of the other ideas around urban space in the late 18th century and the bearing that this kind of military-civilian contact had on the broader stories of the Revolutionary period. Alexandra, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So as usual, I have lots of questions, but I'm going to start it off with an anecdote that leads into a question. So I am from the town of Halifax in Nova Scotia, which is, of course, a big Navy town, but also has had a significant Army presence also for a long time. And there's sort of a semi-apocryphal story that I was told growing up about some sort of distant 18th, early 19th century past, where, you know, when both the Navy and the Army were in town, the Army were up on the hill, the Navy was down in the harbor, and they would kind of march up and down the hill until they met in the middle, and then they would fight. And they would say folksy things like, "Do you want to rub down with me oaken towel?" while they were brawling in the middle of the street, things like this. And the street on which they would fight was also known as Barracks Street. And I say that leads into a question because I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the social position of soldiers themselves and how that might play into how they were thought about fitting into urban space. So who were these guys? How were they thought of? How might they be different from the soldiers that we think of today when we think of what soldiers are like? What kind of social world are they occupying?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, it's a great place to start, and I'm so interested to hear that you're from Halifax. That's one of my favorite cities. It's so beautiful. I love Nova Scotia. Yeah, I mean, the social position of soldiers has gotten a lot of attention. I think the older way of thinking about them was that they were, I think this is the Wellington quote, right? They're the scum of the earth, that basically the lowest level of men in the society who can find nothing else to do go into the British Army, many of whom are basically forced into the Army and the Navy as well. More recent research has suggested this isn't true. If you look at what the soldiers are, you know, and compare what their positions are, what the occupations they have before they enter the Army, they're pretty typical British subjects of this era. You know, they have trades or they're laborers. They tend to be young men who are going out looking for adventure. Of course, many who are coming to North America, many are, the understanding is that they're looking to desert, right? They're going to come to North America and either take jobs in the cities or run off to the countryside and have farms. The other thing I would add about the soldiers that I think we don't always remember is we think of the soldiers, and this was true during the Revolutionary War itself, that soldiers are being brought over from England and Ireland in large numbers, and these are men who are coming to America. During the period leading up to the Revolution, and even during the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, many of the soldiers are colonists because they will send out these recruiting parties to find American colonists. And a lot of colonists say this was a pretty good idea, right? You get a good signing bonus. There's some adventure. You might see some new places. And so we call them British soldiers, but a lot of these guys are colonists themselves, which we tend to forget.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
How many, I know that it was not uncommon for soldiers to either have wives that were they bringing with them, or even their whole families, or, you know, the phenomenon of quote unquote camp followers, which are these perhaps slightly unsavory, perhaps just normal wives who follow these folks around. Would women also be being housed in these barracks?
Yeah. So if you're an enlisted man, right, and you might bring a wife with you, but then you have to pay for her shipment, right, her voyage. If you marry in the colonies, then yeah, that you have to pay for that. But yeah, wives would sleep alongside their husbands in the barracks. I don't know how this works because the beds are mostly occupied by two men sleeping in the same bed. So I assume whole families are just going in together. And of course, officers would obviously rent rooms sometimes in a private house or in a tavern, and they had more money, they could have a more discreet experience with their families. And it's important. The women make a really important part of the story because they're performing labor for the army. The army understands that they're doing the kind of work the men don't want to do, making food, cleaning, doing some basic tasks which are understood as being very gendered and very much stuff that men don't want to do. And so the army will even appropriate provisions for a certain number of women per regiment, because they know that this is unpaid labor that they need someone to do.
John, I was really intrigued by the way that you. This is a geography question, by the way. It's a scale question, and I was struck by the way you started your talk with this cantonment map of the whole eastern half of North America, and you were using that to talk about how few soldiers were kind of permanently stationed in the British imperial possessions for much of the 18th century, until the 7 Years' War and the imperial conflict that began in Europe, kind of reshaped the power politics of the last third of the 18th century. And then you shift to these urban scale maps, right? Suddenly we're in this very micro scale geography of barracks and buildings and people's homes and the private and public spaces of these colonial cities. And it seems to me like there's a story there in some ways about the way that global conflict kind of came home to the colonists, right? And how the practical experiences of what it took to govern and patrol and police and to enforce both the imperial contest between France and England, and then, of course, the suppression and clearance of native peoples further inland, then ramified in the spaces of these colonial elites who were used to kind of having that at a distance, right? They could engage in this fiction that the imperial project it required nothing of them, right? So I'm curious how you see this, especially thinking about public and private spaces, at the grand and small scales, right? It made me think about issues of public domain and public lands that the British Empire is trying to struggle with in the West. And so I wonder if you could elaborate on this, how does thinking at these tiny scale, single block or a single district within, a handful of eastern seaboard cities, how does that reflect this, really transatlantic story of imperial conflict at this time?
Right. And I think there's, that's a huge question and huge consideration. And I think, again, I think the older way of sort of thinking about this was Americans are not used to having British soldiers or really any professional army in their midst. And so when these soldiers show up, the Americans kind of freak out. This is the empire, literally at their doorstep in ways that it hadn't been. And this really causes Americans to think, do we really want to be part of the British Empire or something else? And I think that's probably overstated. The colonists, I think, in my research, work really well with the soldiers because they see them as providing defense. A lot of colonies will be really happy because the militia system had kind of started falling apart by the 1750s, 1760s. And so a lot of Americans are like, oh, good. Someone else is coming to defend us and we don't have to pay for it. I mean, we have to pay to put up the soldiers, build barracks, but the pay, the food, that type of stuff, that's all being paid for out of Parliament. This is great. And it's only very late. I think it's only after the Boston Massacre that we really start to see a shift against that type of thinking. And I mean, it's also a complicated relationship between the soldiers and the civilians. And I mean, this kind of gets us to Canada and thinking about, the American colonies and, sort of more a larger continental context, because the soldiers in places like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, they are not doing law enforcement. They really don't do anything. They're there in case a riot breaks out. And even then, they can't respond unless the governor and the council request their participation. Whereas in Quebec, in Montreal, you see the soldiers are much more active. They're much more heavily leaned on. There's a larger number of them. They're also more anxiety from the British perspective because it's a francophone. These had been French colonists. They're now British subjects, and they're seen with a lot of suspicion. Same thing in the West with Native Americans. I think that'd be another way of thinking about that. That the British want to have a couple of forts. They want to understand what's going on in the West, but they're not interested in a massive war against Native Americans for the interior of the continent, and they're very worried that American colonists, of course, are going to go west, get into wars with the Native Americans, and then the British Army is going to be the one to have to solve the problem at the end of the day.
Yeah.
To jump on that, because one of the things that I wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about, since it actually works well because you've already started talking about it, is these differences in sort of quartering experiences between what we might think of as the classic 13 colonies and all these other colonies. One of the themes that we've had in this talk series so far is we've been really ended up talking a lot about these sort of quote unquote peripheral areas, so Florida and the Gulf Coast especially. And in your book, you suggest that not only that these differences existed, but that they, in some way, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but there is a way in which it correlates between places that throw in for independence and places which remain loyal. So I'd just love to hear you continue the train of thought you were already on, talk a little bit more about that. What made the experience of quartering and having soldiers present different in different places in the empire?
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and I love that. One of the things I sort of started struggling with the book is I've taught the history of the American Revolution for years, and I used to teach about the Quartering Act, right, which gets into this issue of quartering, and I used to teach it as, well, the Quartering Act, forced soldiers into people's houses, and this is why the Americans are revolting. No, the Quartering Act doesn't do that. Actually, the Quartering Act prevents that. It says this is not legal. You can't put soldiers in people's houses, in not so many words, which is interesting because, from my research, I don't find any instances after the 7 Years' War where soldiers are in private houses unless they're except for those who are invited or who are paying, at the request of the homeowner. Versus what's going on in Montreal and Quebec and St. Augustine, where soldiers, and Detroit, soldiers are going into people's houses. There aren't barracks. They don't have the money to build the barracks. They don't want to give the colonies an assembly to allow them to collect taxes, to build a military infrastructure. And so it's always interesting to me, right? There's an irony here that the, or maybe not an irony, but a contradiction, that the places that stay in the British Empire are probably the most abused by the British policies of quartering versus those that do declare for independence.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So why?
Why does that?
Yeah, why? Can you explain that seeming contradiction?
I don't know. I mean, it's that's I guess that's the big question, right? Why do the Americans declare independence? Why are they?
So explain the American independence for us in 20 words or less, starting now.
Exactly. Well, I mean, there's work that's been done on this that's really interesting, and I mean, in one way, and I think this is sort of one way of thinking about it, is that the Americans, the people who settle the 13 colonies, most of them are coming in the 17th century. And so there's an infrastructure, there's a political understanding, there's a political theory, which is much closer to, say, the days of the English Civil War and the relationship with the king who loses his head, versus the Canadian colonies and then the later colonies, which are established under a much different understanding of colonial dependency. The British become very clever by the time you get to the Revolution, of when they're setting up these other colonies, to not give them assemblies and to limit their power. Even in the position of quartering, the Americans, of course, with the Quartering Act, are asked to pay to build barracks and supply blankets and pots and pans for soldiers out of their own taxes. Well, the easiest way to oppose this is just not pay taxes, just to not allow the colonial assemblies to appropriate the money for the soldiers. In Canada, after the American Revolution, Britain says, we'll just pay for it. We're not gonna give your assembly the chance to not provide these articles for the soldiers. So more power is moving back to London, and I think we see some of that here as well.
Yeah, and a case in point, in the case of Nova Scotia, which I know best in the 18th century, it takes them 20 years to put in the provincial assembly, and they basically have to be forced to do it by an act of parliament.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Although I actually don't know where they were housing soldiers in Halifax. I would love to know that specifically if you happen to know.
Yeah, I mean, they built a barracks. I mean, there's originally been this, from the plans I've seen, there's a barracks on that central area between St. Paul's and governmental structure, and that doesn't last, because once they build the fort up on the hill, once they build the citadel, they take those down.
Thank you for indulging me.
John, I'm curious, coming from that same conversation, then let's turn over to some of our viewer comments. But, I'm curious, historically, how much at this time are we seeing like the invention of a spatial distinction between the state and private power, right? I mean, there's been some interesting work done recently about the relationship of these revolutions to small L liberalism, political liberalism, the emergence of a kind of bourgeois capitalist idea of private property and private space. So, I mean, how much of this is people for the first time articulating that, state power has no, or ought not to have a presence in the kind of independent private space of the home? Would that have even conceptually registered 100 years ago? Is this a story of like the invention of a spatial distinction between state and home?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, and of course, I'm going to overstate this argument, but you do have these different moments throughout the 1750s, 1760s, 1770s, where there are these arguments over privacy, right? Things that would be covered in the Fourth Amendment, such as a right to your papers. Things like that, and where were other amendments about unlawful search and seizure. But I think we always overlook what ends up sort of getting dumped into the Third Amendment. This concept of quartering, that for most people, protection of your papers is not that big of a deal, right? It's about keeping the state out of your house. That becomes, and why is the state not able to come into your house? Why are strangers not able to come into your house? And I think in a longer view, it's really interesting, because in the 17th century, and even for a lot of the 18th century, strangers do come into each other's houses, right? There aren't locks on the doors. People just walk into each other's houses. You come to a strange town, you don't go to the tavern because there isn't one. You stay at somebody's house. There isn't real, you work in your home. You do prayers in the home. There really is not that distinction of public and private. The genders are mixed up in that way as well. Women and men are everywhere together. And it's only in the 18th century where you start getting these larger houses, these Georgian structures. You begin to get people thinking about, that the home becomes a private place. Womanhood is also reimagined as something that should be protected within the home. But I think the other piece of this is always the barracks. Once the colonies start building barracks, they can say, we don't have to have soldiers in our houses. And you know why? Because there's a place you can put them. That's a public place where they go. They cannot come here. And then we're getting really close to constitutional arguments about privacy. And it's not fully formed, certainly, by the time the revolution begins, and probably even by the time the revolution ends. We know that the concept of a constitutional right to privacy doesn't show up in Supreme Court rulings until the Griswold decision in 1965. But it will read out of the Third Amendment and some of the other amendments to get to that notion of there is this sacred space of privacy that is the home.
Yeah, it's a really interesting tension, because it's sort of happening in both directions, right? Because you have the creation of a private domestic space, and the army, as we previously discussed, is also its own domestic space. It is not sort of this monogender, the way that we might think of an army barracks today, where, you don't have wives and children and families and domestic operations happening in those spaces. So how does this then tension also work the other direction? Is this tension also part of what undomesticates armed forces?
That's a good question. I don't know. Because it is the thing of as the it's the privacy that the colonists. I'm not sure that I'm going to answer your question, but the privacy that the colonists are claiming, right? This is my home. My home is my castle. These sort of notions are all predicated on the idea that the soldiers then don't have any privacy.
Mhm.
I mean, they're sleeping 2 to a bed. Many to a room. I mean, even officers are doubling up in terms of rooms because that's just what Army regulations are. And of course, the soldiers hate the barracks. They want to be at homes. They want to be somewhere else. They don't want to be because the barracks is an institution. Right. I mean, this is sort of the Foucaultian panopticon already. Right.
I love that it's literally next to the prison and the poorhouse in
Yeah.
New York. Like that's just mwah.
Exactly.
Let's try to get to some of the questions that folks have written in. And again, we welcome, as you're listening and something comes up, please drop a note into the comments. Let's start with Karen, who asks on Facebook, how were soldiers assigned to private homes in Boston and maybe more generally in some of the other cities you talked about? How many of them lived in homes? Out of how many were there?
Yeah, I'm not going to have hard numbers, but I mean, and again, I think if we disaggregate sort of soldiers from officers, I mean, officers it's on them to rent their own spaces and pay for it out of their own pockets, and very few people even in Boston are going to object to renting a room to a major, to a captain, right? There's a prestige that comes with that. In terms of how soldiers, enlisted men, and maybe their families get assigned rooms, is usually a sergeant would be tasked with, or a lower officer would be tasked with going around the town, trying to identify what are places where people can stay. And again, that's in the era of the French and Indian War. When soldiers are coming into town and there really aren't understandings of where these soldiers are going to go. After the Quartering Act in 1765, the only places soldiers can be quartered are in public houses or taverns, or in inns or in abandoned houses, basically warehouses. And so there it's and the idea being that this is a space that's it's not private. You don't live in the business the way you live in your home. And so then that would be basically there'd be a member, a low-ranking officer would go around and make up a list of these are the places we think soldiers can go. And then a sergeant's going to come to your door one day and say, here's some soldiers, make them comfortable.
Great. Lisa on YouTube asks, what revenue sources did the cities use to provide housing for the soldiers? You mentioned these being enormous, complicated structures. Surely they were costly as well. How did they pay for these things? Yeah,
I mean, the same way they pay for everything, through taxes, right? It's the New York is the one I probably know the best. So there's a colonial tax that passes, right? Everyone in the colony is paying for this, and this will probably be mostly import-export duties, which is the most popular colonial era tax. But the city of New York also pays a special assessment, basically a direct tax on the residents of the city. And the idea is understood at the time is, well, this is fair because if we build a barracks and we charge everyone to pay for it, this is spreading out the burden. This is fairer than asking a handful of people to open their houses to the soldiers, which would also be a cost. And in theory, if you have a soldier come to live with you, you're supposed to be compensated by your colony, by your city. But famously, of course, the government can't always cash the checks it writes. So
can't imagine a lot of people saw a return on that.
Exactly.
Lisa had another question, which I think takes us up past the 1760s to the Revolutionary War itself. Where did the soldiers from the American Army bunk when the American forces fought the British? So is the Continental Army or the colonial militias, where are they putting their soldiers? Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, on the one hand, the Americans and British will fight over these barracks, right? So when the Americans control New York, they're putting soldiers in the barracks, but when the British take it, the British put their soldiers there. And early in the war, up in Massachusetts, of course, after Lexington and Concord, when they start building up an army. I mean, even Harvard will be taken over for barracks for American soldiers. And basically they go anywhere they can go. And of course, one of the places in my book, I end right where the war begins, because the Revolution becomes a very different story.
for this. And there's some really interesting people who are writing really good books on this that should be out in a few years, picking up where I in many ways left off. But this sort of very principled stand of soldiers do not go into private homes, that's principled stand that the colonists have, and the British do as well, kind of falls apart once the war begins. And some of that's understood as exigencies of war. You got to put the soldiers somewhere. And if you read the Third Amendment, it's only about peacetime, which prevents soldiers from coming into your house, right? So war is understood as being a different time. But yeah, that's that. During the Revolution, soldiers will often be quartered in people's houses.
Great. John, because you mentioned the amendment, Third Amendment again, I want to ask a sort of, it may start with as a silly question, but I think it'll get to a point. I hope you've seen this before. This is a joke article from The Onion, 2007. The Third Amendment group celebrates 191 consecutive years of protecting private homes against the unlawful boarding of military personnel. Of course, it's funny, right? Because, unlike the Third Amendment, we have other constitutional amendments which continue to be the site of major political struggles. But quartering is not one of those. And you mentioned in your work how it's actually kind of surprising that at the close of the Revolution, the American military moves out of the cities, and they really don't. There is very little military presence in American cities from that point forwards. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the things that I think, sort of going back to the earlier points we were talking about, sort of thinking about the United States compared to some of these other places in what had been the British Empire is the Americans will move soldiers out of the cities. And all these big massive barracks that are built in the 1750s and 1760s, most of them are gone. They don't last the 18th century, which is interesting because this is at the exact same moment when England is building all of these massive barracks, often in heavily populated areas. And of course, they're experiencing the wars of the French Revolution and later the Napoleonic Wars, and they're very worried about, of course, an invasion of the island from France. But and something similar is happening in Canada. So Americans are ripping down these structures in the cities, in New York, in Philadelphia, Boston as well. But they're going up in Halifax, they're going up in Montreal, they're going up in Quebec. It's a very different way, and so there's something very unique in how the Americans are doing this. But I think this is very true, right? And this is true from the Washington administration on, that we move the soldiers out of the cities. We get the military power. Maybe this is some Machiavellian plot, but military power seems more acceptable if it's out of the public eye, if it can be moved farther away, and these forts are moved to rural areas. And it's, the United States has the advantage of not really having been invaded that many times in its history, so it does have the luxury of being able to move forces away from the massive centers of population. And so I think then this means that if we come back to the Third Amendment, the Third Amendment is famously one of the only pieces of the Constitution that's never been the subject of a Supreme Court decision. There is no one has ever sued the Army or the United States of America for quartering soldiers in their house in peacetime without their permission and without congressional law overseeing it, which is really interesting because everything else has been so contentious. So and I don't know why this is, right? Yeah. I'm not smart enough to sort of look at 200 years of legal history and have a good answer. If this is just is this memory from this era? Is this just the Army has decided it's not worth having this interaction with civilians? It's better to reserve military power. But again, the Third Amendment, it's famously effective and famously has never been tested.
And I will say that a joke to me is never not funny is if you have any friends who are military and they come to your house threatening them to invoke the Third Amendment. Just banger, always funny. Yeah, I'm very curious about this, the split that you identify at the end, where the Americans remove military power from the cities and the British sort of double down on it. And I wonder, I know in your book you touch a little bit on some of the policing functions that military plays in some of these places. I guess I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit more. I know we don't have much time left, but I'm just very interested in the conversation that we're having about what is the relationship between soldiers and cities and the civilians that are there. I sort of invoked this rowdy brawling, but we also see sometimes instances of military being used as not a police force per se, but to enforce domestic rest as opposed to domestic unrest. So just like to hear you talk a little bit about what those relationships looked like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess I come back to the colonial city is probably not that different from the modern American city in many ways, right? It's a very diverse population. And people have a variety of opinions about whether that's a good thing or not. And so this the same way you have people of different races, different languages, you have people in different occupations. You just have these soldiers in the cities as well. And I think in some sense, by the late 18th century, this in some sense is just cosmopolitanism. People just expect this is being in New York. This is being in Boston. It's just, this cast of characters, these soldiers moving through the city. And Serena Zabin has done really interesting work on looking at the soldiers and their families that come into Boston in 1768 and the houses they live in and the relationships they have with civilians, because they marry local people or, get into fights and arguments with local people. And they do become part of the community in ways that I think we don't think of them of doing. I think because we're used to, in many ways, I think we imagine soldiers as being distant, as being separate. Yet at the same time, if we have family members who are active military personnel, we know that they also have real lives, right? They also have lives among civilians. They are, you're always connected to the community you're in. You always have families and other connections as well. And I think some of that's going on here as well in ways that we might not expect.
Super. Well, we're just about at the top of the hour, so I want to wrap things up. I mean, first of all, thanks to Professor McCurdy for such a fascinating presentation with really amazing maps that I'm sure we will be seeing again in future Argo presentations.
Yes, I think that almost all of the maps you used are certainly part of the Argo project. So
Great.
Just to plug Argo again.
And I was going to say, within the next 6 to 8 months, look for more about the Argo project as we begin to unveil its first pieces. You can follow us on social media at BPL Maps or subscribe to our newsletter at leventhalmap.org, where you can also find future programs and events, as well as in-person activities at the center. I also wanted to say that you'll be receiving a quick poll, which we'd love to have you fill out about how tonight's presentation went. That helps us to think about what you'd like to see next and what we can change for future presentations. And then finally, to say that the Leventhal Center is an independently supported nonprofit. We rely on the support of donors and supporters. If you enjoyed tonight's program, consider taking a chance after the show to go to leventhalmap.org/donate. Even small contributions help us fulfill our free mission of bringing programs to the public and age groups ranging from grade school all the way up to scholars and adults. John, it's been such a pleasure to have you here. I hope we'll see you in Boston or down in Mount Vernon before too long. But thanks again for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed the questions. So thank you all for both of your questions, but everyone else who typed in questions.
Thanks to the audience for joining us. Again, the program will be available by tomorrow morning on our YouTube channel. We'll also post it on the archived event page on our website. Thanks a lot and have a great evening, everyone.
Bye, everyone.